Unit POIR2580, Week 9's content on genocide and politicide. Before I begin, a content warning that this presentation will be discussing acts of political violence, death, and other graphic content. Winston Churchill once remarked that before World War II, genocide was, to quote, a crime without a name, end quote. The horrors of Nazi Germany, which saw the state-driven systematic extermination of 6 million European Jews, almost 2 million non-Jewish Poles, 220,000 Roma, among other groups, characterized a particular mode of political violence that was synonymous with the apex of human evil. Whilst genocide had existed in many forms before World War II, its act was both not codified in international law nor clearly defined, which changed with Raphael Lemkin's publishing of Axis rule in occupied Europe in 1944, which first denoted the term genocide. The word was derived from the Greek word genos, pertaining to race, stock, and family, with the Latin word cide, meaning killing. His original definition drew to the idea that genocide referred to quote, a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups, with the aim of annihilating the groups completely. Although broad, the main premise of his definition was intentional group annihilation. Lemkin's campaign for the recognition of genocide eventuated in the term for the first time being codified in international law as a crime under the UN Genocide Convention of 1948, as shown here. Whilst a milestone in the creation of genocide as a crime against humanity, the heavy implications of genocide being associated first and foremost with the Holocaust has caused it to be a topic of critical analysis in its interpretation. Most significant of discourse on the UN definition is the lack of political groups as possible victims, excluded in part because of the Soviet Union's intervention in the definition of genocide so as not to be applied to their political killings against kulak classes. The definition has been used for tribunals of breaches in Iraq for genocide against Kurds, in Rwanda and the former Yugoslav Republic with the Srebrenica massacre, with other situations under investigation including the Darfur Genocide in Sudan. When looking at genocidal studies, some points of contention in its definition and interpretation arise. Foremost in the UN definition is it being too specific in its definition of targets with the exclusion of political groups, which resulted in the creation of the term politicide, first coined by Barbara Half and Ted Gurr, which aims to fill in where the Genocide Convention definition lacks, encompassing cases with politically defined victims. Politicide and genocide are not exclusionary, and historical instances can often involve both. Other points of contention is whether genocide is only carried out by the authority of the state or whether non-state actors can have a significance in genocide too. Timeframes are also important in defining genocide, as some lists include the Native American genocide as an expansive systemic cause lasting for almost 500 years, whereas the Srebrenica massacre, defined as a genocide by the UN, had only lasted a matter of weeks. Modes of genocide are important, as many genocides may not involve the use of mass violence and killings, but also aims at cultural genocide, rape, sterilization, or even deportation, which pertains to another point of contention that genocide is defined by political boundaries. By looking at historical cases, I will aim to analyze some of these in greater detail. So before looking at these historical cases, I'm going to outline some popularly discussed preconditions to genocide, discussed in both the readings and some of my own research. The most important point is that genocide is almost never an isolated act of political violence, and that it occurs in line with other modes of political violence, whether it be war, colonialism, or authoritarian violence. Barbara Half's study on genocide and politicide, using data from a comprehensive list of all cases from 1955 to 2001, discusses some different preconditions. Political upheaval was a beginning point where, throughout these cases, the greater extent of violence and regime change would almost always correlate to greater likelihood of genocide and politicide to occur. In these cases, politicide and genocide were more likely to occur under autocratic rule, where power is concentrated in the hands of fewer people. The more politically and economically isolated these nations were from other nations, the more likely the state could enact genocide without repercussions from the international community. This is not to denounce that democracies cannot enact genocide, but that it is less likely. Ethnic and religious cleavages, often identified as preconditions for civil conflict, are likely to enhance the probability of genocide as well. Ethnic and religious cleavages in creating genocide have most often occurred in post-colonial states with arbitrary borders like Iraq and the lack of a Kurdish state, or the Indian subcontinent division with the Bangladesh genocide, among countless other instances centered around periphery states in Africa and Asia. This is also a significant correlation with states of low economic development, another factor Half attributes. The common consensus among many scholars was the most likely precondition to offset genocide was the existence of a civil war, with genocide being one mode of political violence across a greater war. Other genocidal scholars point to genocide common in greater waves of social and political movements pertaining to a wave of genocide enacted by a wider campaign of settler colonialism in the 19th and 20th century, genocide as part of a wave of decolonization, and genocide as part of a greater force of nationalism in the early 20th century. These all valid claims point to the importance of the preconditions of genocide being just as significant to understanding the act itself. The Holodomor, also known as the Terrac famine or Great Famine, was a famine occurring in the Soviet Union under the reign of Stalin, constituting deaths of some 2 to 10 million people, although a general consensus resides just under 4 million. It is at the center of genocidal studies revolved around the genocide question on whether this famine was an act directed towards the Ukrainian people or not. Peasants in the Soviet Union, consisting of a majority of the population, were divided into 3 class-defined groups in Lenin's new economic policy of 1921, including the bedniaks, the poor peasants, the seredniaks, the middle-class peasants, and the kulaks, known as the richer peasants. Following a bloody civil war which took some 10 million lives and the Russian famine of 1921, policymakers relied on the exploitation of the kulaks to recover nationwide. In 1927, the procurement crisis occurred where the price of food fell whilst consumer goods were short in demand. Peasants began selling their surplus of crops for extra cash on the free market, which Stalin saw as class enemies, trying to ruin his attempts at collectivization. All peasants were now required to hand surplus grain, and the free market initiatives installed by Lenin as emergency measures during the Civil War were disbanded. There was less incentive to produce extra grain, knowing that it would be confiscated or for fear of being labeled a kulak. Reduced grain production led to Stalin to believe class enemies were out to wreck the Soviet economy. Thus, a 5-year plan was initiated as a means of industrialization and transformation in the countryside, and extracting surplus from agriculture, which could be imported into the world market. But countries soon began to enter the Great Depression, faulting much of his plans. What followed were increasingly high quotas of harvests, and the use of terror and coercion to force peasants to join in collective farms. Grain was redistributed from the top down, reaching state quotas first, then extra for seed reserves, then MTS workers, then finally collective farmers. Thus, in the face of shortage in 1932, famine would ensue, peasants would strike, and people were unfairly convicted of kulak sabotage. Internal passports in Belarus and Ukraine were issued to restrict movement, and exports could not be halted without the removal of the unrealistic 5-year plan, which Stalin was not willing to do. The fragility of Soviet policies which led to the famine led to the descent of any expression of independence, particularly Ukrainian nationalist sentiments. Ukrainian nationalism was attacked as it was perceived as threatening Stalin's policies. Pro-genocide scholars believe that the famine was deliberately engineered by Stalin to quash Ukrainian national ideals, their culture, and eliminate any possibility of independence, whilst those who argue that the Holodomor wasn't a genocide claim it was merely a matter of these circumstances and that peasants were particularly targeted, of which a larger proportion of Ukrainians were peasants. Now, the image on the right, just up here, is a reflection of both of these arguments, as you see proportionally the deaths of Ukrainians as much higher than surrounding regions, which could point to specific targeting of Ukrainians, but at the same time you see surrounding areas near Dagestan and the Caucasus region also being affected, pointing to poor circumstances of Stalin's forced collectivization initiatives. Whilst I, as a uni student with limited research, can't answer the genocide question of the Holodomor for you, this case aims to bring points up about the genocidal studies and better defining genocide. Okay. Now, higher estimates of death tolls of the Holodomor put it just about equal to the Holocaust, which leads many scholars to attribute an equivalence across both events. Genocidal studies are often laden with comparison and comparing 2 different atrocities with very different circumstances, showing how studies of genocide can often be more telling of the motive of scholars than the act itself. The more popular consensus that the Holodomor is not a genocide also points to the possible need for a redefinition of genocide under the UN Convention of Genocide, as it is the only internationally legally binding definition, and the inexistence of the Soviet Union could give more consolidation to the surviving cultural memory of Ukrainians today. If classicide defined by Michael Mann as the intended mass killing of entire social classes can be acknowledged as a mode of political violence in the Holodomor across Stalin's greater classicide against kulaks throughout his reign, then some then some may argue the need for a revision of other forms of political violence, such as politicide and classicide, as internationally binding crimes against humanity. However, this expansion of crimes against humanity or political violence associated with genocide would lead to the accountability of many more nations, particularly many Western nations during the Cold War, which would not have interest in to recognize subsets of genocide as international crimes, as such crimes are often bound with national humiliation and reparations. The Holodomor as a case study is also reflective of Strauss's reading, where he brings up the point of whether a particular mode of violence constitutes genocide, including that of starvation, where quoted, "Starvation that kills would be a mode of annihilation, but starvation that is designed to bring a group into submission would not be." End quote. Famine as a tool of political violence could scrutinize other nations like Britain during World War II under greater prospects of committers of genocide. Now here I provide a map of countries that recognize the Holodomor as a genocide. The recognition of typically Western states or states that have suffered under the USSR reflects our current political climate between now Russia and Ukraine, particularly with the Donbass region conflict. We see genocide recognition on the international scale as often a ploy of foreign policy. And finally, the contention of the supposed intent of Stalin brings a focal question of genocide into play. Regardless of the intent, the outcome of Stalinist policies had resulted in the mass starvation of millions of innocent civilians. But the sheer focus on just the intent at the forefront of genocidal studies posits it on the apex of political violence, in line with Lemkin's definition on the destruction of a collective cultural memory, having more significance than any other form of mass death. So does the focus on intent in genocidal studies reduce the consolidation of lives due to the nuanced interpretation of such a term? I'll leave it up to you to decide. Now, from the apparent faults of international law in defining genocide and dealing with genocide through the study of the discourse of the Holodomor, I now beg to answer how ethnic cleansing could occur in Europe in the era of the EU by looking at the Srebrenica massacre. The 1992 to 1995 Bosnian War, which saw the deaths of over 100,000 people and displacement of 2 million, saw the worst massacre in Europe since World War II, where 8,372 Bosnian Muslims were murdered in a week. Srebrenica was a town of strategic importance in the war for establishing territorial continuity between the Bosnian Serb army in eastern Bosnia and Serbia proper. The town was a majority Bosniak Muslims, and the area was set up as a safe space by UN peacekeeping forces. However, the leaders of the Army of Republic of Srpska, sorry for my bad pronunciation, a self-proclaimed nationalistic secessionist republic, formed a plan to forcibly separate children and elderly men in order to annihilate able-bodied Bosniak men and boys. In later resolutions, 2 officers of the secessionist army were the first people to be charged of genocide by an international tribunal since the Nuremberg trials. A matter of factors had led to this. Firstly, the power vacuum following the collapse of Yugoslavia and the following civil wars, which in the reading by Crane shows was the most consistent precondition to genocide. The most important factor following this political environment is arguably the existence of ultranationalism in the region pertaining to a superiority of one ethnicity over the other. This in turn helped the dehumanization of one group and racial superiority of another. Unlike Western Europe, where the Holocaust has been openly discussed and admitted by the German government, much of these ultranationalistic tendencies in the Balkan regions have manifested in the creation of post-Yugoslav governments, often in denial or underplaying previous genocides such as the Ustazi genocide by Croatians or Chetnik genocide by Serbs during World War II. The survival of attitudes that allowed these 2 previous genocides to occur under times of conflict can only guarantee the survival of possibility of such atrocities happening again. This repression of these cultural traumas, tied with nationalistic tendencies of superiority amongst a civil war coming from a vacuum of power, had allowed the perfect scenario for genocide to take place. The Srebrenica massacre is also important in showing the failure of the UN in this instance in preventing genocide in a proclaimed safe zone, as UN troops were practically redundant due to their peacekeeping duties, marking a serious loss of UN prestige for their standard of never again in Europe since the Holocaust. And now another case brought forth to the UN Genocide Convention a year after the Srebrenica massacre is the Rwandan Genocide of 1994, where 800,000 were killed in a matter of 100 days, where I will briefly look at the legacy of colonialism in creating the genocide. Pre-colonial Rwandan society had three main social classes: the Hutus, Tutsis, and Twa, often interchangeable, malleable, and definitive of wealth. For example, only owners of cattle were known as Tutsis, and with German colonization, the more European-like Tutsis, according to mostly facial features and height, were assigned as a ruling class aside Europeans, where generally shorter Rwandans, now all associated as Hutus, were put in place to serve Tutsis. With the end of the German Empire after World War I, Belgian rule ensued, where these European constructions of ethnicity were solidified through identity cards, creating an ethnically based rigid caste system of Tutsi superiority. A Hutu government was installed after colonization, but many of the European colonial systems, like that of the race card, were retained, but this time in favor of the Hutus. A Hutu government bowing to the demands of Hutu extremist groups led to increasing discrimination now against the Tutsis, and ethnic conflict increased. After the decree of Tutsis as Ethiopian invaders, supposedly settling in Rwanda during the 16th century, and that land from this imaginary invasion could only be reclaimed under a first strike policy, genocide against the Tutsis ensued. Unfortunately, I've run out of time, but here's another case I was going to cover, one of Western involvement in genocide and politicide, the Indonesian killings in 1965 to 1966, an anti-communist politicide. But what makes this case especially unique, being an integral part of the Cold War, was the US involvement, which saw the US going so far as to giving death lists that were fulfilled, financial assistance, military training, and even involved partial Australian involvement. You can pause here to read more on the slide. And also, the Indonesian killings disproportionately affected the island of Bali, which begs to bring some heavy questions through the denial and covering up pushed up by the Indonesian government. So you see, this is just like a Google search, and it begs to ask, why are places like this shown above places of massacre, genocide, sensitivity, and mourning, whilst below we see a tourist icon sprawling with life where most Balinese were killed in 1965? Denial in many cases can be just as bad as the political violence of genocide and politicide itself.